of wizards. And I was like, this is just going to be a fun conversation. So starting at the beginning, your parents are English professors. Your dad was a poet. Your mom was a professor. And your brother and yourself chose to write fantasy.
Yes, that's true. Is there a question?
How do they feel about this?
That's a good question. And I can tell it's a good question because I don't know quite how to phrase my answer. It's true. We came from a very literary family. Both of my parents were the first people in their families to go to college. And then they both became academics, English professors, and great champions of the great books, the canon, of which there are very few fantasy novels, in their opinion, part of that. And it's a strange thing. For the first half of my career as a writer, I imagined myself as a literary writer. I thought I would be a Jonathan Franzen or a Zadie Smith. And I knew how much that would please my parents. And it's the strangest thing, but I never had much success, and I never was able to find my voice as a writer until I started writing fantasy. And I think that's probably, I wouldn't say that is in spite of the fact that it irritated my parents. I think it is because it irritated my parents. It was a form of much delayed adolescent rebellion when I wrote a fantasy novel. And the fact that they considered it less than respectable, I think that was part of it. It's funny because I meet many writers who come from families that weren't literary, and I had this great privilege, which is that there were a lot of books in my family, in my house growing up, and the question of was writing valuable, were books of value, it was never a question. Everybody knew that. But the strange part of it was, because my parents were both writers, my mom wrote a novel, and she also taught writing at UC Irvine for many years. I don't know if anybody's read The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold. Alice was one of her students. There were so many powerful voices in the house already between my mom and my dad that it took me a very long time to hear what my own voice sounded like. And it wasn't really until I was 35 that I started writing The Magicians, and that was my first successful novel.
So sometimes, and in listening to you speak about that, sometimes fantasy is looked upon as a lesser form of literature, if you will. How do you feel about that? I know that you've been quoted before, or it might have been you quoting someone else, but you said we read fantasy to get through the day, but that's what gets us through the day. I'm misquoting it, I'm sure.
I couldn't quote myself on that one. Okay. I've thought a lot about this, and I find it quite interesting. My wife is an academic who studies the history of the novel, and she has, I married an English professor too. And we talk about it quite a lot. And it's very, what we call fantasy, if you go back through the history of literature, right around the beginning of the 18th century, that's where you have the start of the novel in English. Many people consider Robinson Crusoe to be the first novel in English. And the novels that you see in the 18th century, they're very realistic. They're very much playing by, they're sort of trying to depict sort of social reality. And they're not fantastical at all. If you push further back, if you go as far as Shakespeare, for example, Shakespeare, it's full of fantasy. It's full of ghosts, it's full of monsters, it's full of magic, and witches, and fairies. It has all the hallmarks of what we would consider now fantasy, or at least magic realism. And then you keep coming back, and you have Spencer, and Milton, and Dante. I'm not doing this in the right order. Dante, Homer. Everything back before that is full of these fantastical imaginings So the idea that fantasy would be a less than respectable sort of literary mode, it's a relatively modern one. After Robinson Crusoe and everything else, you start to see fantasy push a little bit to the margins, and it becomes the Gothic, it becomes fairy tales, it becomes children's literature. So I find it quite fascinating the way that fantasy is only now kind of moving back towards respectability and towards the center of our culture. And if you sort of look at it, take the long view, the last couple centuries have been the exception rather than the rule. I delivered the speech to my parents. They didn't find it convincing at all. I find it very consoling. The idea that by writing fantasy, in some way I'm connecting to an older tradition of writing, has less to do with chronicling social reality, which is also a really important thing to do, and more pulling from the unconscious and from mythologies to make its meanings felt. I find that actually a satisfying thought.
With that being said, how do you see current fantasy as it is? With all the genre blending that we are experiencing, we have romantasy, as you will, and cozy fantasy, things of that nature. Is this good for the genre? Is it bad for the genre? What are your thoughts?
We're living in a great age of fantasy. I mean, I'm old enough that when I was a kid, fantasy was much more off by itself in a little niche, and it was kind of looked down upon. It was really, I have to say, the coming of Harry Potter, which made fantasy a truly mass global phenomenon. The idea that there could be a fantasy book that everybody read, that sort of wasn't plausible when I was a kid. But then fantasy has spread so wide, and yes, it is sort of evolving and kind of hybridizing. I mean, you get these amazing books like American Gods, or Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is a particular touchstone for me. These books that are written with the kind of literary sophistication that we associate with literary novels, but their plots, their actual substance is that of the fantasy novel. And yet, romantasy, the way that the genres are blending and kind of producing these fascinating hybrids, I love it. I find it so interesting, and I have no idea where it's going, but I can remember in 2004 reading Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is a big chunky book, and I frequently give it as a gift, and I get about a 50% success rate of people actually finishing it. But when I read it for the first time, it was like a thunderbolt. I didn't know that you could do that with words, and it was instantly, that's what I wanted to be doing. And it still is. And I still constantly see people doing absolutely amazing, interesting things. Not long ago, I don't know if you guys follow this at all, but the New York Times did a list of the 100 greatest books of the millennium, of the past 25 years. And they constructed that list by polling a bunch of writers and critics. They polled me. I gave them my top 10. I was surprised by how poorly fantasy was represented on there. There really wasn't very much, except for N.K. Jemisin, which is great, but I feel like they could have taken that a lot further. And I have a feeling if they do that poll again in 100 years, we'll be a lot more fantasy on there.
I hope so. Why do you think it takes some fantasy writers so long to generate the novels? Is it the chunkiness of the book? Like, I'm not saying like Rothfuss and Martin, for example, we're waiting on novels, whereas we look at some other genres and mystery writers have a novel out every year. Is there a method to this madness, or is it just speculation?
I wish I knew. This novel, Bright Sword, it took me 10 years to write it, which I find absolutely astounding. I had no idea when I began that it would take that long. I take a little bit of consolation that it took Suzanne Clark 10 years to write Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but only a little bit. I suspect it has, in the case of, I don't know Patrick Rothfuss very well. I'm quite friendly with George R. R. Martin. we talk once in a while. I go to see him in Santa Fe. I think it probably has more to do with their particular personal quirks. I think in George's case, he wants that book out there as much as anybody. I think it looks from the outside that he's possibly lazing around and enjoying his billions of dollars that he has, who could blame him? I think it's much more that his standards for himself are so high, and he judges his own writing so harshly that I suspect he is looking what he's writing, just think, is it good enough? Is it good enough? And he can't let it go. I suspect there probably are writers of many genres who run into that. There are certain fantasy writers, like Brandon Sanderson, who are amazingly prolific. I wish I were one of them. I don't know how they do it. That's the true mystery. How do they get those books out every year?
So you mentioned some of your other favorite titles, like Giles Drink, Miss Moore. What's your favorite post-apocalyptic story? There's obviously a reason behind that.
Yeah, sure. I do love a post-apocalyptic story. I think that's the first time on this book tour that I have said post-apocalyptic and not the whole word out without starting. I became very obsessed with The Last of Us while I was writing this book, both the game and the TV show. That's the first example that comes to mind. Somebody's not completely blank by any others, but there must be others.
That's fine. So, with that being said, The Right Sword is a bit of a post-apocalyptic novel. We're joining the story after the end has come, so to speak, and being dramatic as possible as I can about it. Right? Arthur obviously passed on, and we're joining the story there. Is that something you were, in the past with the magicians, you removed the big bad, you took away the guiding figure. Is this the Lev writing style, or is just you want to write a post-apocalyptic story of this is where we're going to build from here?
You know, I'll tell you the honest answer. I guess there's a few honest answers to that question. To back up a bit, I've always loved King Arthur, and for most of my life, most of my career as a writer, I didn't have any particular interest in writing about Arthur. I loved him, and that was enough, because I felt that the books that existed already, I thought we were done, basically. We had said everything that there was to say about Arthur. We told the story. T.H. White, the Once and Future King, was the big one for me. But of course, with so many others, Rosemary Sutcliffe, Mary Stewart, Mists of Avalon, The Winter King by Bernard Cornwell. These amazing, amazing books that come at this same story from so many angles. For a long time, it never occurred to me to write something about Arthur. But it's a funny thing about the King Arthur story, maybe unique, I don't know. It's often said about, I think it was William Gibson who said that science fiction is set in the future, but it is always about the present. And I think you could actually say something similar about King Arthur. King Arthur is always set in the past, but it tends to be about the present in which it's being written. When T.H. White writes Once and Future King, it's very much in the shadow of World War II. It becomes a story about violence and about war and the problem of warfare and how can we as humans get away from it. But if you look backwards, you go to Tennyson and it becomes one of those Victorian things about innocence and experience. If you go further back, it becomes a story about kingship, becomes a story about the sort of Christian ideals of virtue and how impossible it is for humans to truly attain them. Every age kind of gets their own Arthur. And I began to think, that T.H. White's Arthur seemed enough time had gone by that it belonged to a different age, and I began to wonder, what would our Arthur look like? what would an author for this age have to say to us? And I didn't feel like I'd quite seen it yet. And almost as a thought experiment, one of the great strokes of genius that T.H. White had was to tell the story of Arthur's childhood. When I read the ones in Future King and Sword in the Stone, I actually didn't know that he made all that stuff up. All the story about Arthur as a kid, and Merlin shows up as his tutor, changes him into different animals, teaches him important lessons about kingship and other stuff, and Kay gives him a hard time. I didn't realize that T.H. White made that stuff up, that he had added that stuff to the canon. He found, in a way, a kind of a blank space on the map. Even after more than 1,000 years, when I started writing about King Arthur, I didn't actually realize how old he was. The earliest King Arthur stories come from 7th century, like very, very far back. So we've been telling Arthur stories continuously, over and over again, for 1,400 years. We've never stopped. And yet, when White came to that story, he said, look, no one's ever done this bit, and he filled it in. And it was wonderful. And almost as a thought experiment, I started to think about where other blank spaces would be that hadn't been told. And one of the stories that I thought of was the time after Arthur's death. And this was prompted, probably, if I'm being completely honest, by my reading of A Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones books, which begin, they don't really begin with it, but the engine of the narrative is really the death of the king, arguably the death of two kings, but most noticeably Robert Baratheon. When the king dies, the kingdom falls apart, and there is a massive succession crisis. There's a massive war to see who will be in charge. And this has happened over and over again in world history, certainly in British history. I'm particularly fascinated by Henry I. Henry I dies. He's got a daughter. He had a son. His son drowns. So he's got a daughter. He's got, I don't know, 4 or 5 nephews. Well, they're not really used to having a daughter take the throne following the father. But she is the most direct descendant. Then you've got all these nephews over here, and they're sort of saying, well, we're not actually his sons, but we are male, so maybe we ought to be king. And there's a civil war that lasts 25 years. Looking at Arthur, who famously, for reasons that are a little obscure, only had the one child, and that child was Mordred, who's I think we can agree, is not king material. And the two of them die, they kill each other. And that leaves the throne unoccupied, and there's no child, there's nobody obvious to fill it. Arthur argues that he has sort of nephews in the Orkneys, but the Orkneys are all dead at that point. He's got Morgan Le Fay, she's problematic in her own way. It's clear that there's a succession crisis brewing. And in the Morte d'Arthur, which is the great sort of medieval English telling of the Arthur tale, which is sort of very, very canonical at this point, the throne passes to this guy named Sir Constantine, who has appeared literally 3 times in the entire book, and he's never said anything. Who is this guy? He's sort of a nobody, and he sort of jumps onto the throne, and everybody says, well, that's all settled then. I didn't think that that's how it would happen, and I began to play with this idea that with Arthur gone, you would have Arthur's Britain, this very familiar chivalric world that we all know and love so much, but it would begin to fall into civil war and fragment and grow dark in that same way that Westeros does, and I became fascinated with that idea. Not just because it was cool and you'd have lots of cool battles, but there's something recognizable about it. There is something in this moment right now, culturally, and I'm at a loss to put my finger on exactly what it is, but this idea of the apocalypse is very resonant for us. I feel like we're pursuing it in a lot of different stories. There's this sense of, in some invisible way, that things have fallen apart, and we've kind of lost our guiding star. We've lost our way a little bit. It's the institutions that we used to rely on aren't taking care of us the way that they used to. And I began to realize this is a post-apocalypse story. This is Fallout. This is I Am Legend. And it suddenly became very alive to me, and I started to have an inkling maybe this is the Arthur story that we have been waiting for. Obviously, you can't really have a King Arthur story without King Arthur in it. So much of the book is it consists of flashbacks to the past. I was very much inspired. This is the other post-apocalypse story that I was trying to think of. Station 11. Station 11. Everybody's read Station 11. Emily Don Mandel. One of the things that I found very beautiful about that book is that it's not a sort of straightforward linear story. It takes us sort of rocks forward and backwards. It's the central moment of the apocalypse, and we see what happened before, and we see what happened after, and we watch the connections between those two worlds, and we really feel the changes in everybody's lives and what everybody's lost. I loved the way that she structured that book. And I wanted to take some of that to the right, so we could move backwards and look at King Arthur's time, look at that golden age, but highly kind of look at it from the vantage point of the coming apocalypse, and looking back on it. And I felt like we would perceive it differently and see a different story there than we'd seen before. It's a really long answer. I hope that I covered some of what you were asking.
No, you covered, and more of that, and where we can lead directly into. So you mentioned Constantine a second ago, and we kind of have that with your knights that are leading the story of who are these guys. But they're a fun ragtag bunch, and how did you go about choosing which knights you want to use?
Well, my sense of what happened after Arthur died, because it's not really covered in the Once and Future King, or really not much of anywhere, I didn't have a good sense of what did happen after Arthur died, what had been written about it. And what I rapidly came to realize is that almost everybody is dead at that point. The Battle of Camlann, Arthur dies, and Mordred dies. Almost everybody dies who had not already died. Gawain's already dead, Galahad's dead, Tristram's dead, Lionel, Lamorak, all the Orkney brothers. There's really hardly anybody left. And the feeling that I had when I realized that was one of pure and unadulterated panic, because there was nobody left to tell the story. And then if you sort of really look at it, you realize, well, Bedivere has to be alive, because Bedivere, after Arthur dies, Bedivere takes Excalibur and throws it back in the water. So we've got one guy, at least. And then you think, oh, but wait, there's another group of knights who had followed Lancelot across the channel, and then Lancelot and the knights come back, but they're too late. So there actually are there's a little handful of knights left. There's Lancelot, he's retired, he was in a monastery, but he's still alive. And then there's a few very peripheral characters, very secondary characters, who have spent their whole lives working around in the very margins of the King Arthur legend. And I suddenly realized that what I had in my hands was not a bug, it was a feature. Because there was now this wonderful opportunity to take these guys, whose stories never really got told, whose voices never really got heard, to take them from the margins of the story and usher them to the center of the stage and said, you guys, you were never the heroes. Now's your chance. Now you guys can step up and be the heroes, and now you have a story you can be the hero of. I found that very, very appealing, and it was an opportunity. It's sort of more blank space on the map. It was an opportunity to tell some kinds of stories that, even though we have been retelling the story of Arthur for more than 1,000 years, there were still some stories that had never been told, and I found that idea very compelling. Again, I thought about T.H. White, who, as you can tell, is something of an obsession of mine. There's no really proper biography of T.H. White, and I strongly urge anybody in the audience with the slightest inclination to go and write it, because I wish somebody would. So we'd have, we know some things about his life, and one of the things that we know is that he probably wasn't straight. His sexuality was complex. I don't know if he was gay, I don't know exactly what he was, but he wasn't straightforwardly straight. And that's not the kind of relationships that he had. But he never writes about that. In The Once and Future King, all you have are these very heterosexual relationships, which there's nothing wrong with them. But I felt as though White had this whole area of his life experience that he couldn't write about, and I found that quite touching. And I realized that the world wasn't ready for him to do it, but now it was. Now it was. Now you could tell those kinds of stories, and it seemed like an enormous opportunity to me.
Yes, and I thank you for writing those stories. The progressive nature of the book and where you took it, how personal was it for you to do some of that? And I'm leading you here, I know, with the questions, but.
I'll give two answers to that. And one thing I say is this may not even need saying, but I read online today for the first time something that I have been waiting to hear, which is that somebody wrote a little note basically saying, "Oh, good, now we have a woke King Arthur." Who the hell wanted that? No, thank you. It didn't say no, thank you. They said something less polite. But in a way, I was relieved to read that because I had been waiting to read it. And there's a level on which I truly understand that. Like everybody, I have political opinions. And I think, like a lot of people, I'm actually not that interested in reading novels that are out there to score political points. That's not for me. I'm all for political points, but in my literature, I'm not that interested in it. What I am interested in as a reader and as a writer is human beings. I'm very interested in human beings and human experience. And if there are human experiences that have been less written about, then all the better. And when I think about someone like Sir Bedivere, I'll give you a spoiler. Sir Bedivere is gay. And I feel sure that there were gay people on the round table. There's gay people in the NFL, there's gay people in the NBA, there's going to be gay people on the round table. I feel absolutely positive of it. And they are having their lives. And what is that like? What is that like? It's probably quite challenging. It's probably quite alienating. One probably feels quite judged. One is probably full of these lots of feelings that you have that you can't express, that you have to keep inside you and pretend that they don't exist. I think everybody has had that experience, having to keep things inside and not betray them. It's not a gay thing. It's like a very human thing, and I found that human story very touching, and that is why I wanted to tell that story. And there's a knight who writes who's not white. There's a knight who struggles with mental health. There's a knight who is trans. A very strange thing that I will never be able to explain is that, so I wrote, it took me 10 years to write this book. During that time, my children grew up. And my oldest child, halfway through the writing process of the Bright Story, he came out to me as trans. And that was something that I never knew about him or even remotely saw coming. And I had been writing this story about a knight who was trans. Obviously the story became suddenly much more personal to me. He and I talked a lot about it and what that experience was like. And even though I'm not myself trans, I found so much in that experience that I could identify with and empathize with. Also, there was so much that I got wrong that he could then correct, which was also very helpful. I can very much understand where that person was coming from online. I could totally understand it. But for me, it wasn't really about that. It was about these stories that I just found too compelling not to tell.
With what you were just saying, so there are no good fathers in this story whatsoever. Everyone's a terrible father, and it's a different story in the storylines, and all the way to Colin with his relationship with his father. What does this book mean to you as a father?
Well, that's another good question. It's true about fatherhood. I think this is something that attracted me to the story of King Arthur. How much it is about fathers and sons. And what it really is a story about, this is something I kept coming back to when I felt like I'd lost the thread of it. The story of King Arthur is the story of this huge and totally dysfunctional family. It's like Succession. You have, or it's like Arrested Development. You've got Uther, who was Arthur's father. This guy is he's a real nasty piece of work. You got Igraine, struggles with many of the problems that Arthur struggled with, and you could watch him. In advance, spoiler, that Arthur dies. Arthur is undone by the problems that he faces. And you watch Colum, and in the back of your mind, hopefully, you're thinking, will this guy negotiate those same challenges and come to a different outcome? And part of that is doing something that Arthur never did, which was making peace with his own father. Not only his earthly father, but also God. God is probably the closest thing to a father figure Arthur has left. And their relationship, like all father-son relationships in the Arthur world, is quite fraught.
So, you did a lot of research, a ton of research, that shows in the writing of this, but why do we love Arthur so much that we keep coming back to the tale, that we now get to have all woke Arthur? And get to keep doing this. I love that, by the way. I'm keeping that. It's a question that I don't have a good answer to. I mean, I'm conscious that there are aspects of the Arthur story which are probably universal is the wrong word, but that we in the Western world at least, we keep coming back to. One of them is the idea of the Golden Age, particularly the Golden Age that has passed away and that we have just missed. And we can still see it in the rearview mirror, but it's gone forever. And that's part of Arthur's story. And then part of it is that longing to be good. I mentioned having to do with Lancelot, but it's true of Arthur as well. These are people who long to be better than they are. They have an ideal of who they should be. It's very clear to them, because God's made it really freaking clear what he wants, and they long to fulfill that, and they are facing the headwind of their human imperfection. I think those are themes that we've never let go of in the past 1,400 years, and probably never will. But then there's mysterious aspects of the Arthur story, and I think there's also that story of the family, actually. It's never the wrong time to be telling stories about messed up families. That is always breaking news. And then there's the other aspect of the Arthur story, which is that it has this chameleon-like quality, which is that it changes its nature and its meaning to suit the world in which you are reading it. And that too is, that property of it is mysterious, but I think that is why it has lived for so long. And even now, even writing it now, I felt aspects of the story resonate with me that I had not seen as part of the tradition in the past, that I felt had never really been brought to the surface of the story. Definitely. So, with that and the progressiveness and the newness of the story, you can read this and never having picked up King Arthur before and not really feel like you're missing out. And you could have read all the lore before and again feel like, oh, okay, this is another King Arthur story. Delving into some of the characters a little bit more and not giving too much away, you took a huge swing at Merlin. And I absolutely loved it. But I mean, this is a unique way that we see Merlin in the past. Again, is more of a guiding figure. And, as we've identified, or you've identified in the past, you don't like guardian figures and magicians. Was there some sort of extra thought going into that, or just...
That's interesting. When you ask that question, it's making me think about my treatment of Merlin in a new way. This is, above all, this is actually, even though it's configured in a funny way, it's actually a very classic Arthur story. There are people who have rubbish Arthur. There are people who have taken it completely into a completely different world. This actually isn't really like that. You've got the sword and the stone. You've got Excalibur, you've got, which is not the same as the Sword in the Stone, I often get them confused. You've got the quest for the Holy Grail. It's in some ways a very classic Arthur. And then in other ways, there's some variations on the theme. And it's true, one of them has to do with Merlin. And it broke my heart a little bit to approach Merlin in this way, because I love Merlin. I love Merlin, so everybody loves Merlin. There's the Merlin in the TV show, that Merlin is great. There's T.H. White's Merlin, also really great, and fun, and avuncular. And yet, I was thinking about Merlin and how I could treat him as a character, and who I really thought that he was. And I came across something written by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is a little bit of another obsession of mine. I've always loved his work, and he was an incredibly intelligent guy and a fascinating reader of King Arthur. He actually wrote a fair amount about King Arthur, even though he never really wrote a King Arthur story. And he wrote about Merlin. In fact, Merlin, I think it's in Thy Hideous Strength, Merlin makes an extended cameo, and people talk about Merlin. And I remember reading this about Merlin, and C.S. Lewis saying that obviously Merlin was a druid. Which I had never made that connection before, but of course he was. Of course he was. He was a practitioner of the indigenous magical arts of Britain, and that was the Druids. He must have been. And it immediately raises some questions, which is Merlin, if he's a Druid and he's a pagan, what is he doing at the court of this Christian king? Because Arthur is many things, but one of them is he's very Christian and very zealous. Why would Merlin be aiding and abetting Arthur's work and his mission? Another question comes up. Well, actually, hey, there weren't actually supposed to be any Druids in this period. Famously, and you can actually hunt up old Roman accounts of this, the Romans, when they took over Britain became a Roman province for 3.5 centuries. And one of the things they did to consolidate their power in Britain was they exterminated all the Druids. The Druids were this kind of, they weren't kings or chiefs, but they were kind of almost above the chiefs. They were the kind of spiritual leaders of the British Celts. And they held all the lore and the history and the religion and the magic of the Celts. They didn't ever write it down. They just had it in their minds, and they passed it one to the next. Well, the Romans, who were very efficient imperial administrators, saw the Druids as a threat to their power, which was correct. They were. And so they killed them. They hunted them down. They hunted them with dogs, and they herded them across Britain. They rounded them up on an island, Anglesey, off the coast of Wales, and they killed them all. And it's an incredible thing to think of, and it almost definitely did happen. There are many things we're not sure about, but I'm pretty sure that happened. They killed all the Druids, and because the Druids' lore was strictly oral, they didn't write it down. Everything they knew was lost forever. And we actually know very little about the pagan beliefs of the Celts for that reason. But there was one Druid they didn't get, and that was Merlin. And you have to wonder, what did he do? What bargain did he make to save his own life? It probably cost him a lot. And there are other aspects of Merlin that I find troubling. One of the primal sins, one of the original crimes of the Arthur story, is the story of Uther and Igraine. Uther falls in love with Igraine. Igraine is already married. Not a problem. If you're Uther, you're the king. You kill her husband, and then, to really twist the knife, you have your court magician, Merlin, cast a seeming of the dead husband on yourself. So you look like him, and then you go home and say, "Honey, I'm home," and then you sleep with her. She's thinking that it's her husband, and you beget a child, and that child is Arthur. No points to Uther for this. It's really disgusting that he did that. But no points to Merlin either for making it happen. And it doesn't really square with the avuncular chuckling wizard of T.H. White. There's some darkness in that guy who would do that. And I guess I followed that dark thread to see where it led.
Great, thank you. And a question that has nothing to do with the bright sword whatsoever. Do you have an agreement with your brother to not write superheroes?
I want to put something on the record here, which I've never actually stated publicly. So I don't know if you guys know this, I have a twin brother. He's actually my identical twin. I'm fairly confident that if I walked in there and then he walked out again, you guys wouldn't notice. We look a great deal alike. My brother and I are both writers. And my brother, he writes about a lot of things, but one thing he likes to write about is superheroes. He writes novels about superheroes. They're amazing. I strongly urge you to run out and find them. It's true that there is an understanding, stated out loud, that we will stay off one another's turf. He is already, by the way, on my turf. I was the first one to be a novelist, and then he decided that he would like to be a novelist. There's no law against it, but I do feel like, I'm being very big about it, that he gets to be a novelist too. And actually, to make it worse, he's a very good novelist. Much better if he was a lousy novelist. But I will only add that before he wrote his first novel, which is called Soon the Invincible, very strongly urge that you read it. It's an absolutely wonderful novel, and he just recently followed it up with a sequel. I had actually written a short story about superheroes. It was a kind of, I haven't read it in years, I don't know if it's any good, but it was about what it's like to be a superhero, and it kind of was like a literary treatment of what it would feel like to be a superhero. It's a short story, never published, but he read it. I sent him to read it. Then 2 years later, out comes the novel. Do I have bragging rights? Well, his novel was much better than my short story, but I do feel, on some level, that I got it first. But I magnanimously now have seen that territory.
Thank you.
It's like the Romans saying, okay, the Picts, that's fine, you can have Scotland. We're going to build a big wall, and you guys stay on that side of it.
I think we're going to open up for questions now.
If anybody has any questions, I have a microphone, and I can pass it to you. All right.
I'd be first. So I'm glad you've already done some spoiling. I enjoyed the novel very much. Arthurian romance is a lifelong hobby of mine, more than fantasy novels, which I've not read that much of. I'm wondering two things. One is that both as to the stories that are in the book, particularly the flashback stories, but also as to the personalities of these hitherto less written about knights. Was there primary source material that particularly informed you, where you got your stories from? I mean, I immediately recognized you getting revenge on Kay for the way he behaves in What's a Future King. That's easy enough, but did you primarily get your stories out of Mallory or out of Creighton or other places? Well, my other question is the same question that we always have about Arthurian stories: is your geography. Did you have a source and a map in your head about where these places fall?
Years of my life were spent on the question of the geography of the Bright Sword. I'm going to begin there. One of the things that I loved about the Magician's books was that when they were published, they printed a map on the end papers that showed where the adventures took place and the geography of the whole story. If you study the end papers of the Bright Sword closely, you will notice that they are blank and do not contain a map. That's because Arthurian geography, it's very hard to make it out. There are a lot of references to places that are actually turn out to be quite important, but and they give you very little sense of where those things are. And unlike, for example, Tolkien or George R. R. Martin, Tolkien and George also, they are very particular about how long it takes somebody to get somewhere else in the stories of Tolkien. They have their maps, and they actually work out how many days on horseback would it take to ride from here to there, and they never cheat. They never cheat. But if you're trying to retell the stories of Mallory, suddenly Britain becomes very stretchy and elastic. And it sort of just takes as long as you might feel like for somebody to get somewhere. And they're always stumbling on entire kingdoms and countries within Britain that no one had ever noticed before. So I found the geography very vexing, and I read academic treatises on Arthurian geography, of which there are some. The other problem is that so much of what we know about the King Arthur story was elaborated during the kind of mid to high Middle Ages. And people writing then used their own geopolitics. So there's a lot of stuff about the Welsh being sort of feisty and rebellious, and they're always trying to be pacified and things like that. But they're really telling a story that took place in the 6th century, when, of course, there were no Welsh people, because Wales didn't exist. Because Wales is actually the Celts, having been pushed west in the Celtic diaspora. So you just get into this absolute thicket of anachronisms and irreconcilable things. So I actually, if you have any comments about the geography, I'm really curious to hear your impression of it, because I struggle with it a lot.
Well, you sort of solve it at the end by the way they get around in the last section of the book. You sort of solve it on cheating a bit, I think.
Yes, it's true. As it turns out, Arthurian literature it's founded on cheating, but cheating with geography. And it's difficult, because you've got the north up here. Well, it's not Scotland, because they didn't have Scotland. You can call it Pictland, as many people do. But it's very it's difficult to know how to reconcile these periods, because the Arthurian legendarium is so much a mashup of about 1,000 years of British history. It's very vexed. It's a very vexed question. There was another part here.
Well, about you have primary source material, both the stories and the characters.
Yes, I played pretty fast and loose. I mean, one of the characters I use a lot is Sir Dinadan. So Dinadan, he's not really a major character ever, but we know about him that he's a wit. If someone's going to get off a good one in the Great Hall of Camelot, it's probably going to be Sir Dinadan. And so I borrowed him and gave him, most of the good lines. I borrowed Sir Palomides, who's a Muslim knight. There isn't much to go on with Sir Palomides in terms of his backstory. There isn't a lot of information about where he came from or how he came to Britain. But the history helps you out, because you would imagine a Muslim from that period was probably coming from kind of Golden Age Baghdad, which was a fascinatingly sophisticated and advanced civilization, far ahead of where Europe was at that time. And so when he gets to Britain, he has to conceal some disappointment, because nobody there knows anything about spherical geometry or anything like that. Sir Dagonet, is always the court jester at Camelot. He's a well-established figure in the canon. He's the jester. Arthur thinks it would be funny to knight him and put him on the round table, even though he doesn't really know how to hold a sword. And so the knights are always knocking him off his horse and having a big laugh about it. I don't think Dagonet historically has ever had a line of dialogue in Arthurian literature. So, people like that, I get very interested in what their experience of life was. So I relied in some ways heavily on the canon, and then I employed it where necessary or where I felt like it. I kept Sir Constantine around. I felt guilty that I had deprived him of the throne that Arthur gave him, so I give him a part in the story. Amazingly, he has father issues too. What are they on? He has a lot of trouble with his dad, who's the king of Cornwall. It's interesting writing Arthurian fiction, because you are very conscious of 1,400 years of forebears, and they're in this ghostly way, looking over your shoulder and reading what you're writing, and discussing among themselves, is this good enough? Can this really be part of the tradition? And the paradox of it is that you want to be writing something that is organically connected to that tradition, and that is conscious of it, and that is part of it. And at the same time, these spectral figures who are watching you they don't want you to do exactly what they did. They want you to make it a little bit different so that you have advanced the tradition a little bit, and not merely repeated what they said, but which bits do they want you to change and which leave the same? Sometimes it's hard to know.
Hello.
Hi.
You kind of mentioned earlier that you have an obsession with C.S. Lewis, and I mean, you read The Magicians, you kind of get that. But
Yeah.
do you have any other thoughts on what the rest of the Inklings thought of the King Arthur story that you are waiting to share?
I know that they thought about it a lot, and the most obvious suspect is Tolkien. Tolkien, of course, wrote a half of an Arthurian epic, and then he stopped in the middle. He wrote a poem called The Fall of Arthur, and it's actually fantastic. It's great. You're very aware that you're reading the work of the master when you read it. But then he stopped in the middle, and he wrote a letter to his publisher explaining why it was that he stopped. And his reasons were very interesting. And one of them was that he admits that he's not really on the side of the Celts. He's on the side of the Saxons. Even though King Arthur died trying to keep the Saxons out of Britain, and that is, part of his tragedy. Tolkien was a Saxon guy and felt very uncomfortable with these Celts, these indigenous Celts, with their wild pagan Iron Age beliefs. And ultimately, he just he couldn't hang with that Celtic energy. He also points out, which is true, that the Arthurian world building is, I think in Tolkien's word, incoherent. It is incoherent. Tolkien was a real stickler for world building. If he's going to have an elf in his book, he's going to first write the entire Elvish dictionary and then put the elf in. As opposed to Lewis, who was very fast and free. Mallory is very fast and free with his world building. But clearly it irritated Tolkien. And then, most interestingly, he tells his publisher that he can't write about Arthur because Arthur is too Christian. Tolkien is clearly Christian. He had a very profound faith. He is the guy who converted C.S. Lewis. So he's no slouch when it comes to Christian faith. But he felt as though, on some level, he didn't want his fantasy and his Christianity to touch. And so he wanted to keep them separate. But of course, there was lots of other Inklings, and they all had interesting feelings about Arthur. I don't know if David Jones counts as an Inkling, but his essay about Arthur, which has some obvious name called, it's like The Myth of Arthur or something. He wrote an essay about Arthur, which is just the most brilliant thing anybody has ever written about Arthur. And I must have read it 20 times, just looking at the way that he dissects the mythology. But it would be fascinating to know. I'll have a brief epilogue to this, which is that I'm actually only 1 degree of separation away from C.S. Lewis, because my mom, when she was younger, actually met him. My mom is 87, and she grew up in London, and she went to Oxford. And this was at a time when Lewis was already older. I think he had stopped teaching at Oxford, and he was teaching in Cambridge, but he liked Oxford better, and so he came back there a lot. My mom, as her senior year, she's on her way to take her final exams. And in Oxford, this was a great big ritual. It was an oral exam where you face a whole room full of professors. It was called the Viva. And they would interrogate you about whatever your subject of study was. And so my mom is on her way to her Viva. And as you do, she stopped and popped into the Eagle and Child, which is the famous pub in Oxford where Tolkien and Lewis and the Inklings hung out. She pops into the Eagle and Child just for a little racer, to give herself a little courage. and she sits down at the bar, and there, at the other end of the bar, at about 10 in the morning, is this old red-faced old buffer, and it's C.S. Lewis. Or as I think he was known in life, Jack. I don't know why he was called that. It's Jack Lewis down the other end of the bar, and they get to chatting, and Jack says, well, if you're going to take your Viva, you really ought to have a brandy first. And my mother, in her innocence, had never had brandy before. But I guess if C.S. Lewis is sliding a brandy down the bar to you, you have no choice but to drink it. So she had brandy. And she claims that she has no memory of anything that happened for the entire rest of her life. But that's why a degree of separation from C.S. Lewis, and now you guys are now 2 degrees of separation.
As someone who loves a good Arthurian retelling and reimagining, do you have any favorite media in terms of television and TV where you had a great portrayal or even a not so good portrayal that just kind of made you smile? And is there any particular actors or people you kind of imagine being some of the main characters in your book?
That's a good question. And then my answer is going to be a little bit of a cop-out, which is that as soon as I knew that I was getting into this, I went on a little bit of a fast when it came to movies and TV about King Arthur, because I wrote these books, the Magician's books, which were then turned into a TV show. And if I'm being honest, when I look at the books now, I see the actors in my head who played the parts, or at least the ones that I liked. So I didn't want to be overly kind of colonized by the images of particular actors when I was writing. So I went on a little bit of a fast, and I didn't watch the Charlie Hunnam King Arthur. I didn't watch the Merlin show, even though everybody I know loves it. I steered away from it. I did feel a strong identification in my head between Sean Bean and Sir Bedivere, and in fact, that is in fact how I pictured that particular character. To the point where I had a picture of Sean Bean, which I pasted into the document. So if I ever got confused, maybe it was I just look at Sean. I think he was the only one though who I did mental kind of fan casting. And mostly I think because I was trying to stay out of it. Now, of course, I can do it all I want. And I'm really excited to go back and watch all that stuff that I missed.
Hi. This is the first book of yours that I've read, and I was a little bit nervous. It's a thick one, and I was a little bit like, okay, is this going to be really, really super wordy in the language, deep language, and then when you put at the beginning of book 1 your quote from Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail, I felt, oh, I can do this. I was so thrilled that there was so much humor in this book. I thoroughly enjoyed some of the wit that you were talking about. Did you do that specifically on purpose to make that more of the Arthurian stories for this time? Because there are certainly some language there that is very much of our time, but delightful. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I'm really glad that you enjoyed it and that you weren't repelled by its extreme thickness. Which, by the way, as a writer, I didn't really know. Literally until they sent me in a box the copies of the book, I didn't know it was so thick. I was a little bit appalled by that. So I share the feelings about that. And it's funny about that Monty Python quote. If you ever try to write anything about King Arthur, you will rapidly realize how smart the Pythons must have been. In order to make it funny, they clearly had to think it through on a very deep level and kind of identify what was absurd about the story, which requires actually some certain depth of knowledge. Looking back on it now, having become a big King Arthur nerd, it's even more impressive. And it's funny about that quote because a good friend of mine who is English, he read the manuscript and he gave me some feedback on it. And he said, but the one thing that he was really serious about was that I had to take that quote off of it. Because if I had it on there, I would never be taken seriously as an Arthurian. And I said, Jaunty, his name is Jaunty, he's so English. Jaunty, if that means I'm not going to be taken seriously, I don't want to be taken seriously. And I kept it on there. Now I'm glad that I did.
I think we have time for one more.